The phone that called me that night had no wire running to it. I want to say that plainly, before anything else, because it is the part people stop believing when I tell the rest. There was no line in the wall, no power to the jack. A man whose entire job was to know these things stood in front of me and swore it to my face. And it rang anyway, with a sound like a bell at the bottom of a well, and when I answered it, a voice told me about a man who was going to die in 11 minutes, in a present tense, as if it were already happening, as if time had folded in on itself and left me holding the crease. I still smell it sometimes. That's the thing I can't get past. A clean burning smell, like a struck match in the rain, copper and ozone together. When it comes now, in my kitchen, in a parking lot, I freeze where I stand, because for 2 years, that smell meant the dead line was about to wake up and hand me a name. I'm going to tell you all of it, not because I think it will help me. It won't, but there's a logbook somewhere in a county storage unit with my handwriting in it. Handwriting I don't remember making, and one page is missing because I tore it out and kept it. I look at that page more than I should, and I think someone should know what it says before the smell finds whoever sits in that chair next. Let me go back to the beginning, when I was just a person who needed a job. The voicemail is still on my phone. I've never deleted it. 41 seconds. My brother Eli, the last thing he ever said to anyone. I won't play it for you and I won't play it for myself, but I know the shape of it by heart, the way you know a stair you trip on in the dark. He called me at 20 to 4 in the morning, and I was so tired, and his name came up on the screen, and I thought, not tonight. I thought, he's drinking again, he'll be fine, he's always fine. I let it ring out. I turned the phone face down and I went back to sleep, and the smell of that decision has been in my nose ever since, long before I ever heard of ozone. They found him a little after dawn. The coroner put the time at around 3:47. I never told a single person that the call had come in. Not our mother, not the police, not the grief counselor the hospital sent. I let everyone believe I'd been asleep with the phone in the other room, and that lie became a stone I carried under my tongue. Eli had needed someone to pick up, and I had been the one person whose job, in that moment, was to pick up, and I didn't. I think that's why I took the dispatch job. I've never said that out loud either, but I've had a long time to be honest with myself, and I think I went looking for a chair where the only thing I had to do, the entire moral content of the work, was answer the phone, where I could never again let it ring, where if a stranger was dying in the dark and reaching for a voice, I would be the voice. Some people do penance in church. I did mine on the night shift, in a cinder block building, for $16 an hour. It wasn't only the guilt. I won't pretend it was. I needed the money. I'd lost my last job after Eli died. Just stopped showing up one week and then it was gone. And the county was hiring because nobody wanted overnight in a place like Hollick. The recruiter on the phone sounded almost surprised that I'd applied. There's a lot of turnover, she said, in a careful voice. And I should have heard something in the way she said it. People don't last long out there. They burn out. It's the isolation. That's what she told me, and I took the words at face value because I wanted the work, and I wanted the dark, and I wanted the chance to never miss a call again. The Hollick County Regional Communications Center sat at the end of a frontage road past the grain elevators, a low gray building with a flat roof and a chain-link fence that nobody had locked in years. 3 townships had merged their emergency lines into that one room after the budget cuts, which sounds efficient until you understand it meant 1 or 2 people covering 900 square miles of farmland and river bottom and bad county road, with the nearest ambulance sometimes 20 minutes from anywhere. The building had been something else first, a civil defense relay station. Back in the 60s and 70s, one of those concrete bunkers built to keep a phone line alive through the end of the world. You could feel that in the walls. They were too thick. The doors were too heavy. The place had been designed to survive something. Inside, the main room was a horseshoe of consoles, maybe 8 stations, though only 2 were ever lit at once and most nights only 1. The rest sat dark with their monitors off and their chairs pushed in, like a classroom after everyone's gone home. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, one of them always on the edge of failing, ticking in a corner of your hearing. There was a wall map of the 3 townships with colored pushpins in it, a coffee machine that left a burnt caramel smell over everything by 2 in the morning, a microwave, a bulletin board with a softball schedule from a summer that had already passed. It was ordinary. That's what I need you to understand. It was so ordinary that the wrongness, when it came, had nowhere to hide. There was one part of the building that wasn't ordinary, and I noticed it on my first walk through, though I didn't think anything of it then. Down a short back corridor, past the bathroom and the break room, there was an old equipment room behind a metal cage, the kind of mesh enclosure you'd see around a server rack. Inside the cage, against the far wall, sat a switchboard that belonged to another century. Brown enamel, gone yellow at the edges, a panel of dead jacks and a heavy black handset on a cradle, with a cloth-wrapped cord that ran down into the floor and stopped. Just stopped. The conduit had been cut and capped. There was a work order taped to the cage, sun-faded, marking the whole unit decommissioned, and a date on it from before I was born. On the wall above the switchboard there was a clock. An institutional clock, the kind with a sweep second hand. Except the second hand wasn't sweeping. The clock was stopped. I remember glancing at it and thinking somebody should change the battery, and I remember the time it showed, because of course I do. 3:47. I didn't connect it to anything. Why would I? It was just a stopped clock in a locked cage, in a building full of forgotten equipment. I walked past it, and I forgot it, the way you're supposed to forget things like that. I trained under a man named Reyes for 2 shifts before he transferred out. He'd been a dispatcher for 19 years, and he had the flat, unhurried voice of someone who had heard every kind of human being on the worst night of their life. He taught me the system, the codes, the cadence. He showed me how to keep 2 emergencies straight at once, without letting either caller hear that you were splitting your attention. He told me the one rule that mattered, which was that your voice is the only thing the caller has, and a steady voice can keep a person alive through the 20 minutes it takes for help to cover those bad county roads. I liked him. I trusted him. That's why what he did at the end of the second shift stuck with me. We'd walked the building one last time, and we passed the cage, and I asked him about the old switchboard, just making conversation. He didn't slow down at first, but I watched him decide something, and then he stopped, and he turned around and came back, and he stood close to me in that narrow corridor and looked at the cage instead of at me. "That one's already dead," he said, "so when it rings, you'll want to answer it, because answering's the whole job. It's the only thing you know how to do. That's the trap. It only rings for the kind of person who can't let a phone ring." He paused, and the something tightened around his eyes. 19 years I never picked it up. You do the same. Whatever it's telling you, it already happened, and you can't get there first. Then he walked away down the corridor, and he didn't say another word about it. And at the time, I thought it was the strangest thing, an old hand spooking the new hire on his way out the door. 2 days later, he was gone to a posting 3 counties over, and I had the night shift to myself, and it was months before I understood that he hadn't been spooking me. He'd been confessing. The work was the work. For the first few weeks, it was exactly what I'd been told. Cardiac events, a barn fire out on the river road, drunk drivers, domestic calls, an old woman who phoned every night around 11 because she was lonely and frightened, and her husband had been dead for 6 years, and I learned to stay on with her for a few minutes, even though it wasn't an emergency, because that was the closest I could get to the thing I'd come there to do. I got good at it. I want you to know I got good at it, because what happened later wasn't about being bad at the job. Dana was the one who got me through those first weeks. She worked the day shift, and our hours overlapped in the gray hour before dawn at the changeover, and she was the warm thing in that cold building. A single mother, 2 kids, a laugh that filled a room that wasn't built for laughing. The first morning I worked alone, she came in early, before her shift, with a paper cup of real coffee from the gas station and a foil packet of 2 breakfast sandwiches, and she set them down at my console without making a thing of it. "The first solo overnight's the worst," she said. "You sit out here long enough and you start hearing the building talk." She told me to write the noises down if it helped. Said she used to keep a little notebook her first year just to prove to herself in the morning that the sounds had reasons. Then she showed me a photo on her phone, her 2 kids in matching pajamas, both of them missing the same front tooth, and she laughed at that. The same tooth. Can you believe it? Like the universe planned it. I think about that photo more than almost anything. She gave me the idea of the notebook that morning, kindly, over a gas station sandwich, and I have wondered ever since whether some part of her knew exactly what she was handing me. The first time I smelled the ozone, I was eating one of those sandwiches at the console at around 2 in the morning, and I thought a wire had shorted somewhere. That clean burnt match smell, copper underneath it, rolling through the room like a draft. I got up and checked the breakers, and sniffed at the consoles, and found nothing warm, nothing scorched, and after a while the smell faded, and I sat back down and finished the sandwich. I logged it as a possible electrical issue for the maintenance contractor. I was thorough like that. I didn't yet know the smell was a warning. I thought it was just the building being old. It was a Tuesday, or the early hours of one, when the deadline first rang. I'd smelled the ozone maybe 90 seconds before, strong that time, strong enough that I'd stood up to look for the source, and that's when the sound came down the corridor. It wasn't the chirp of the modern phones. It was a real bell, a mechanical bell with a clapper, and it was pitched low and slow, one long ring and then a pause and then another, coming from the back of the building, from the equipment room, from the cage. I stood very still in the middle of the horseshoe of dark consoles and I told myself a dozen reasonable things. A phone can't ring with no power. A line that's been cut and capped can't carry a signal. It was a fault in the wiring, a feedback echo, some ghost current in the old copper. I told myself all of that, and then I walked down the corridor toward the sound, because I had been hired to walk toward ringing phones, because a ringing phone was the one thing in the world I had sworn I would never ignore again. The cage was locked. I didn't have a key. The work order still hung faded on the mesh. And inside, on the brown switchboard, the black handset was ringing in its cradle, lifting almost imperceptibly with each strike of the bell, the cloth cord lying dead and disconnected on the floor where it disappeared into the capped conduit. I stood there with my fingers hooked in the mesh, and I watched a phone that could not ring. The ozone was so thick I could taste it, like a battery on the tongue. And then I looked up, past the switchboard, at the clock on the wall, and the stopped clock said 3:47, and for the first time the number reached into me and turned something over, because 3:47 was the time my brother died, and I felt the floor tilt very slightly under my feet. The bell stopped, the handset settled, the smell began to thin. I went back to my console and I sat there with my heart going hard, and I wrote in the log, in the careful neutral language we were trained to use, that the legacy switchboard had produced an audible ring at approximately 2:06, cause unknown. Then I went home at dawn, and I didn't sleep. The next night it rang again, and this time the cage was already open. I don't know who opened it. There was no maintenance scheduled. The padlock was simply hanging unhooked from the hasp when I came on shift, and I told myself the contractor must have been by. And when the ozone came and the bell started, I walked down that corridor, and I pulled the cage door open, and I stood in front of the brown switchboard with my hand a foot from the ringing handset. That one's already dead. Reyes's voice, close in the narrow corridor of my memory. But the bell rang, and every instinct I'd built in that chair, every nerve I'd wired together out of guilt and penance, pulled my hand forward, and I lifted the handset, and I put it to my ear, and I said the thing I said 100 times a night. 911, what's your emergency? There was a sound on the line that I can only describe as distance. Not static exactly. A vast, hollow, breathing distance. The sound you'd hear if you held a shell to your ear, and the ocean inside it was 1,000 miles deep. And then a voice came out of that distance, and it was the worst part of all of it, because it wasn't a monster's voice or a demon's voice or anything you'd put in a story. It was flat, genderless, calm in a way that had no person behind it, like a recording of a recording. Reporting an emergency in progress, it said. Present tense. I remember the cold of that, the present tense, because what it described had not happened. It gave me an address. A farmhouse out on Sable Road, the Vesper place. I knew the name from the map. It told me there was a man down in the kitchen, not breathing, that the time was 3:18. It said all of this in that even, hollow voice, and the only thing wrong with the time was that the clock on my console said 2:51. The man it was describing was not yet down. The emergency it was reporting had not yet begun. I asked it questions. Of course I did. I asked who was calling. I asked it to stay on the line. I asked it to confirm the address, and it gave me nothing. It simply repeated the report, word for word, in the same flat cadence, reporting an emergency in progress. The Vesper place on Sable Road. A man down in the kitchen. 3:18. And then the line went to that hollow distance again, and then it went dead in my hand, and I was standing in a cage at 2:52 in the morning holding a disconnected handset, listening to nothing. There was nothing on the computer. No call had come in. The screen was quiet. I told myself it was a hallucination, a fatigue dream. that I'd micro-sleepwalked down the hall and imagined a voice. I went back to my chair. I drank cold coffee. I wrote nothing in the log because I didn't trust what I'd write. And at 3:16, the real line lit up. A woman, screaming, the way they scream when it's real, and the address she gave me through the screaming was the Vesper place on Sable Road, and the emergency she was reporting was her husband down in the kitchen, not breathing. I ran the call the way I was trained. I kept my voice steady. I talked her through chest compressions while the ambulance covered the 11 miles of bad road, and they did everything right, and the man was gone by the time they wheeled him out, and the time of death they logged was 3:18. I sat in that quiet room as the sun started to gray the windows, and I thought about the timestamps. 2:51 on the deadline, 3:16 on the real one, 25 minutes. The line had called me before anyone dialed. It had given me the address and the victim and the exact minute, and I had done nothing with it, and the man had died on schedule. I want to tell you I went to a supervisor that morning. I want to tell you I did the reasonable thing, but who would I have told, and what would I have said, that a phone with no wire had predicted a death and I'd believed it? They'd have sent me to a doctor, and maybe they should have. So instead, I did the thing that comes naturally to a guilty person who needs to feel in control. I started keeping a separate log, a paper one, in a county-issue notebook I bought myself, the way Dana had told me she once had, because I didn't trust the computer system, and I wanted a record that only I controlled. Every time the deadline rang, I wrote down the address, the victim, the time it gave me, and the time it actually happened. I told myself I was gathering evidence. I think I was just trying to feel like I was holding the thing in my hands instead of it holding me. The calls didn't come every night. That was almost worse, the not knowing. Some weeks the ozone never came, and the bell stayed silent, and I almost convinced myself I'd made the whole thing up. Then a Thursday would come and the smell would roll through the room, and I'd walk down that corridor with my notebook, and the voice would report an emergency in progress, present tense. And 20 or 30 minutes later, the real line would light up and confirm it. Address for address, minute for minute. A car off the bridge at Ellard Crossing. A fire in the trailer park behind the feed store. An old man who fell down his own basement stairs and lay there for the 8 minutes the voice had given me before his daughter found him. I started to understand the pattern, and understanding it broke something in me, because the pattern made a promise. If the line told me before anyone dialed, then I had a window, 20 minutes, 30, sometimes more. I had time, for the first time in my life, to pick up a call before the worst of it, and to send help early, and to beat the thing that was coming. I had the one thing I'd never had with Eli. I had the time to answer, so I tried. The call came in on the deadline a little after 1 in the morning. The ozone, the bell, the cage already open the way it always was now. The voice told me a woman was going to fall on the ice on the back steps of a house on Current Street, that she'd be down and unable to move in the cold, that the time was 1:52. It was January. It was 19 degrees. A woman down outside in that cold for any length of time was a death sentence. But I had over 40 minutes, and I had her address. I dispatched a unit immediately. I made up a caller. I logged a welfare check on Current Street, a neighbor reporting an elderly woman who hadn't been seen, and I sent an ambulance and a deputy out into the cold to get there before 1:52, before she ever fell, so they could knock on her door and keep her inside and break the schedule. I sat at my console with my hands flat on the desk, and I prayed, actually prayed, for the first time since the funeral. The unit arrived at 1:49, 3 minutes early. I heard the deputy on the radio, calm, reporting that he was at the residence on Current Street, that he was approaching the house. And then I heard him go quiet, and then I heard him say, in a different voice, that he needed the ambulance crew on the back steps, that there was a woman down, that she was on the ice and she was cold, and he didn't think she'd been out there long, but it was too late. She was already gone, and the time he gave for the death was 1:52. They'd gotten there before it happened, 3 minutes before, and it happened anyway, exactly on schedule, while a deputy stood at her front door, as if my sending him had not prevented anything at all, as if it had sealed it. I think that was the night the real horror started, the one that lived in my chest instead of in the cage. Because up until then I'd been afraid of the line. After that night I started to be afraid of myself. I started to wonder whether the calls were predictions, or whether the line needed an answer to make them true, whether by picking up I was the one closing the circuit, the one signing the order. I'd come to that chair to be the person who answers, and now answering might be the thing that killed people. I couldn't tell anymore which was worse, picking up or letting it ring. Both led to a body, The only question was whether I had blood on my hands or just on my conscience. I went to the maintenance contractor. His name was Tomlin, a heavy-set man who handled the county's electrical and the network, and I caught him on a morning when our shifts overlapped, and I asked him about the old switchboard in the cage. I tried to sound casual. I said it had been making noises, that I'd heard a ring, that I wanted to be sure there wasn't a fault that could affect the live systems. He laughed at first. He said that thing's been dead since before the merger. No power to it. The conduit's capped. You couldn't get a signal through that line if you wired a car battery to it. But I asked him to check, and to humor me, he came back to the cage with his meter, and he opened it up and he put his probes on the terminals, and I watched his face change the way Reyes's had. There was nothing. No voltage, no current, no continuity. The line was as dead as he'd said, and then he looked at the cradle, where the handset was sitting slightly off, the way it sits when someone has just hung it up, and he asked me, in a careful voice, whether I'd been touching it. I told him I hadn't. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he packed up his meter and he told me he'd file it as no fault found, and he left faster than a man usually leaves a routine job, and after that he stopped taking the overnight calls himself and sent a younger tech for anything at our building, and the younger tech wouldn't go down the back corridor alone. I tried to reach Reyes. I'd kept his number from the training paperwork. I called him 3 times over a week, and the first 2 times it rang out, and the third time the number had been disconnected, the recording telling me it was no longer in service. And when I called the county personnel office to ask how to reach him, they told me he'd retired early, moved, no forwarding number on file. 19 years, and he'd vanished, like a man getting out ahead of a flood. He'd known. That was the thing that sat heaviest on me. He'd worked that chair for 19 years, and he'd told me the truth in a corridor on his way out the door, and I'd been too new to hear it for what it was. The only person I could talk to at all was Dana. She didn't know about the deadline, not really, and I never told her the worst of it, because I didn't want to put it on her, and because I didn't want her to look at me the way Tomlin had started to. But one morning, half joking, I asked her about the building, about the old equipment, about whether there'd ever been anything strange in the place. She got quiet in a way that wasn't like her, quieter than the day she'd talked about her kids, and she told me about a dispatcher from years before her time, before the merger even, a man who'd worked the overnight alone and who'd left mid-shift one night and never came back, just walked out and was gone. They found his car still in the lot in the morning, his coffee still warm at the console, and the man himself never turned up, not a body, not a trace. She said it like a campfire story, the way you tell a thing you don't quite believe but don't quite disbelieve either, and then she looked at me and asked if I was sleeping okay, because I looked terrible, and she said it the way she'd say it to one of her kids, and I said I was fine, and that was a lie too, and I think she knew it. I should have left then. I want you to understand that I had chances. After the woman on the ice, after Reyes vanished, after Tomlin's face, after Dana's story, I had chance after chance to walk out that heavy door and never come back, and I didn't take a single one, and the reason I didn't is the same reason I took the job in the first place. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just understood the rule, if I just learned what the line wanted, I could finally be the person who picks up the phone and saves somebody and undo the one night I hadn't. The line had found exactly the right person to sit in that chair. It had found someone who could not, would not, walk away from a ringing phone, no matter what it cost. That was the trap, Reyes had said. It only rings for the kind of person who can't let a phone ring. And then I made the worst decision of my life. And I made it for the most reasonable reason, which is that I wanted to know the truth. I decided to test it. I needed to know whether the line was predicting or causing. So the next time it rang, I would not answer it. I would let it ring out. I would not pick up. I would not dispatch. I would do nothing, and I would see whether the death still happened. If it didn't, then the line needed me, and I could stop it forever by simply never picking up again. If it did, then the line was only a messenger, and the deaths were coming whether I answered or not, and at least I'd know that none of it was my fault. Either answer would have set me free. That's what I told myself. I wanted to be free. The ozone came at midnight. The bell started down the hall, low and slow, and I sat in my chair, with my hands gripping the armrests, and I did not get up. The bell rang and rang and rang. It rang longer than it ever had, dozens of rings, the clapper striking that low bell in the dark cage at the end of the corridor, And every ring was a hand pulling at me. Every ring was Eli's name on a screen at 20 to 4 in the morning. And I dug my fingers into the chair and I let it ring. I let it ring out. The smell of ozone filled the whole building until I could barely breathe. And then the bell stopped, all at once. And the silence afterward was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I sat there and I waited. I told myself nothing would happen. I told myself I'd broken it. And at 12:41, the real line lit up. It was a kid, maybe 19. He was on a county road I knew, out past the elevators, and his car had gone into the ditch and rolled, and he was pinned, and he was scared, and I ran that call the way I run them all. Steady voice, stay with me, help is coming, tell me about yourself, keep talking. And while I kept him talking, I pulled the dispatch and I sent everything I had, and I knew, the whole time, with a certainty that hollowed me out, that this was the call I hadn't answered. This was the death the deadline had tried to report at midnight, and I had let it ring out, and the death had come anyway, only now there'd been no early warning, no 20-minute window, no chance to send help ahead, because I'd refused to listen. The boy died while I was talking to him. He got quiet the way they get quiet, and I kept saying his name into a line that had gone soft and far away, and the units reached him too late, 11 minutes too late. The exact 11 minutes I might have had if I'd picked up the dead line and dispatched early. And here is the part I have never been able to put down. When they recovered his phone from the wreck, the call log showed that in his last minutes, before he reached me, he had dialed another number first. A number that, when the county checked it, did not exist, had never existed, was not a working number anywhere in the system. He had dialed into nothing and gotten no answer, and then he dialed me, and I had picked up too late. I understood then that letting it ring did not save anyone. The line didn't need me to make the death happen. The death was always coming. What I controlled was only whether I got the warning, only whether I had the chance to try. And I had thrown that chance away to run an experiment, and a 19-year-old boy had died in a ditch in the time I bought myself by refusing to listen. I had done it again. I had let the phone ring. The whole shape of my life had bent back around and put me right back in my bed at 20 to 4 in the morning, deciding that the call could wait. I broke a little after that. I'm not going to pretend I held it together. I started coming in early and leaving late. I started reading the paper log obsessively, the one I kept, going back through every entry, every address, every time, looking for a system, a pattern, a way to predict which nights it would ring, so I'd never miss one again. And that's when I found the entries I didn't write. They were in my handwriting. That's what I keep coming back to. My handwriting, my slant, the way I cross my sevens, addresses and names and times in my own hand, on pages I had no memory of filling, calls I had never taken, deaths I didn't recognize, and the dates on them were wrong. Some of them were dates that hadn't happened yet. There was an entry, in my own hand, in ink, dated 4 days in the future, an address out on the county line, and a time and a single word after it that I won't repeat because I don't want to say it about a real person. And 4 days later, that exact death came across the real line at that exact time, and I sat there reading my own handwriting, predicting it, and I did not know when I had written it, and I have never known, and that is the moment I stopped trusting my own mind. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I know there's a clean explanation, that I was sleep-deprived and traumatized and dissociating, writing things in fugue states and forgetting them, and the matching dates were coincidence or confirmation bias. I know all of that. I told myself all of that. But you can't explain away ink, and you can't explain away a stopped clock that reads the minute your brother died, and you can't explain away the smell that came before every single call and never once after a false alarm, because there were no false alarms. The line was never wrong, not once, and neither, it seemed, was my hand. The night it called for me, the ozone came at 3 in the morning, earlier and thicker than ever, so strong that my eyes watered. The bell started down the hall, and I sat in my chair, and I did not want to go, because some animal part of me already knew, and I went anyway, because of course I went, because I always go, and I opened the cage and I lifted the handset, and I put it to my ear, and I said, 911, what's your emergency? And the line breathed its long, deep distance at me, and then the flat voice came. Reporting an emergency in progress, it said, and it gave me my own address. It gave me the number of my own house, my own street, in that even hollow voice, and it told me there was a person down, and it gave me the time, and the time it gave me was 3:47. The same minute on the stopped clock above the switchboard. The same minute Eli died. The voice said it the way it said everything, without wait, without mercy, reporting an emergency in progress at my own address at 3:47. And then the line went to its breathing distance, and then it went dead in my hand. And I stood in that cage holding a disconnected phone and looking up at a clock that had been stopped at 3:47 since before I ever set foot in that building, as if it had been waiting for me the entire time, as if everything, the job, the chair, the penance, had only ever been the long way around to this. I did the only thing left that felt like control. I went to my supervisor. His name was Halverson, the overnight regional supervisor, a man I'd spoken to maybe 4 times in 2 years, and I drove to the county building at dawn, and I waited outside his office, and when he came in, I told him everything. I had the paper log. I laid it on his desk. I told him about the deadline, the ozone, the timestamps, the woman on the ice, the boy in the ditch, the entries in my own handwriting, the call with my own address. I told it all in the flat, steady voice I'd built in that chair, because it was the only voice I had left, and I watched him listen, and I watched him not be surprised. That was the thing. He wasn't surprised. He let me finish, and he closed the notebook, and he folded his hands on top of it, and before I'd said the word ozone, he reached over without looking and cracked the window behind his desk, the way a man does, out of an old habit he's stopped noticing, and I hadn't told him yet about the smell. He told me, in a kind and careful and absolutely immovable voice, that I had been working too many hours, that the overnight shift was hard on people, that the isolation got to everyone eventually, and then, gently, almost as an afterthought, he said it was a shame, that I'd lasted longer in that chair than most, longer than the last few, and I never told him how long I'd lasted, and I never told him there'd been others. He said the center was being evaluated for consolidation anyway, that the legacy equipment was scheduled for removal, that there'd been talk for years of closing Hollick and routing everything to the regional hub. He said all the right things, and every one of them was the thing you'd say if you already knew, and were only deciding how much of it to let me keep. And then he slid the notebook into his desk drawer. He said he'd need it for the file, for the wellness review, and I never saw it again. I went back to the center one more time, on my last overnight before the reassignment took effect, to clear out my locker. And while I was there, I checked the computer system, the digital record I'd never trusted, and I found that it had been edited. The welfare check I'd logged on Current Street, the made-up caller, the dispatch I'd sent to try to save the woman on the ice, was gone. Not corrected. Gone, as if I'd never entered it. The boy in the ditch was still there, but the timestamps had been smoothed, the gaps cleaned up, the 11 minutes I'd lost no longer visible to anyone reading the file. Someone had been in the system behind me, tidying, the way you'd straighten a room before guests arrive. The record now told a clean story about a center that worked the way it was supposed to. And down the back corridor the cage stood open, and the brown switchboard had a strip of tape on it now, a fresh work order, scheduled for removal, and the clock above it still said 3:47. I should have stayed away from the building on the night the line had named. I knew the address it had given. I knew the time. The reasonable thing, the only thing, was to not be at my house at 3:47, so I made the decision that I thought was the smart one, the safe one, the one that finally broke the schedule. I would not go home. I would stay out. I would be in a diner, under bright lights, surrounded by people, at 3:47 in the morning, miles from the address the line had given, and let the appointment pass, with no one to keep it. I texted Dana before her shift, because she was the one person I trusted, and I told her something half true, that I wasn't doing well, that I might not be at the center, that I was going to take care of myself for once. I meant it as the responsible thing. I meant it as the opposite of every wrong choice I'd ever made. I sat in that diner from 2 in the morning on, under the bright lights with a coffee going cold, watching the clock on the wall, and I felt the minutes go by, and at 3:47 I was nowhere near my house. I was 11 miles away, with a waitress refilling my cup, and the minute came, and the minute passed, and nothing happened, nothing at all, and for one full minute, I believed I had finally won. I had answered every call wrong my whole life, and this time I had answered by refusing, and I had broken it, and I started, God help me, to feel something like relief. Then my phone rang, the real one, in my pocket, and it was the center, the live line, rerouted to my cell because I was still technically on call, and the dispatcher who'd taken over for me was on the other end, and her voice was doing the thing my voice did when it was real and bad. There'd been a call, she said. A welfare check, a neighbor reporting a car in the driveway and a door standing open, at my address. And when the deputy got there, he'd found a woman on the kitchen floor, not breathing, and they were working her, but it didn't look good. And did I know her? Because her ID said her name was Dana. She'd gotten my text. That's all it was. She'd gotten my half-true text about not doing well and not being at the center, and she'd done what a good person does, what I had not done for Eli. She'd driven across the county in the dark to check on a friend who'd scared her, the way she'd check on one of her own, and she'd found my door open, and she'd gone in, and she'd died on my kitchen floor at 3:47 in the morning, in the spot the line had named, keeping the appointment I'd run 11 miles to break. The line hadn't been reporting my death. It had only ever needed the address. It had needed someone to be standing in that kitchen at that minute, and I had made sure, with my responsible, careful, self-protective choice, that the someone was the one person in the world who'd come looking for me. The one who'd handed me a notebook over a gas station sandwich and told me to write the noises down. I had let the phone ring on Eli, and he died. I had picked up the dead line, and strangers died. I had refused to pick it up, and a boy died in the time I saved. And on the last night, I had tried to outrun it entirely, and I had sent the warmest person I knew straight into the chair I'd left empty. There was no version of answering, and no version of not answering, that did not end with someone I'd failed lying still while a clock read 3:47. That, I think, is the only thing the line ever wanted to teach me, if it wanted anything at all. That picking up was never the part that saved anyone. That I had spent my whole life believing the phone was the thing, when the phone was only ever the smallest part of it. They closed the Holic Center within the month. Consolidation, they called it, routing everything to the regional hub, the thing Halverson had said was coming for years. They pulled the legacy equipment out, the whole brown switchboard, the cage, the stopped clock, hauled away in an unmarked truck to a storage unit somewhere, with 1,000 other dead county machines. The wellness review concluded that I was suffering from job-related stress and trauma, and recommended I not return to dispatch work, and I agreed with them, because by every measure that any one official could see, that was the truth. There is no file anywhere that says a phone with no wire called me before anyone dialed. The record is clean. The record is always clean. Someone is always there to straighten the room before the guests arrive. But I tore one page out of that notebook before I ever gave it to Halverson. I'd already done it, days before, almost without deciding to, and I'd folded it into my wallet and forgotten I had it until weeks later. It's one of the pages in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing. There's an address on it I don't recognize, in a town I've never been to, and a name I've never heard, and a time, and after the time there's that one word I won't say, and the date on it is not a date that has passed. The date on it is still ahead of us. I check it every morning now against the news from that town, and for a long while there was nothing, and I told myself the nothing meant the page was just paper, just ink, just a sick mind talking to itself. But the page has started to change. The ink is the same ink, my same hand, but there's more of it than there was. There are details on it now that weren't there when I tore it out. A make of car, a color of door, the number of a house, arriving a few words at a time the way the calls used to arrive, as if the page is being filled in slowly, patiently, from somewhere I can't see, the way the voice used to fill the silence on the line. I haven't written a word of it, I'd swear to that, but it's my handwriting, and it's getting closer to finished, and every day that passes with nothing in the news from that town is a day closer to the day the page is done. That's the part I can't put down. The line never needed the phone. The phone was only the smallest part of it. It found a way to write through me, and it sent me out into the world with one last appointment in my pocket that fills itself in while I sleep. And there's nothing I can do but check it each morning and wait, and fail at it the way I've failed at all of them, because by the time the page is finished it will already have happened, and I will never get there first. I don't work near phones anymore. I can't. When a phone rings in a public place I have to leave the room, and sometimes, in my kitchen, in a parking lot, in line at the store, I catch it. That clean burning smell, copper and ozone, like a struck match in the rain, and everything in me goes still and cold, because I know what that smell means. I will always know what it means. And I stand there and I wait to hear a bell at the bottom of a well, And I think about the chair in Hollick that's empty now, and I wonder who they put in it, and whether the equipment really stayed in that storage unit, and whether somewhere tonight there's a tired person sitting alone in a bright room who has just decided, the way I once decided, that the call can wait. And I want to tell them, I want to find them, and tell them not to answer it, and not to ignore it, and not to test it, and not to run from it, because none of those will save anyone. I know that now. I learned it 1 minute at a time. But I don't know where the chair is. I only know the smell, and the bell, and the number on the clock, and the one thing the voice always said, flat and patient and waiting, reporting an emergency in progress, as if it had all the time in the world, as if it had already happened, as if it always would.